Chapter 4: Trouble with a Capital T. On the other side of the world, James was unlocking the front door and heading inside after a long, boring day at school. He made himself a ham and cheese sandwich with lettuce and after a few quick bites decided it was time to get to work on the game he was calling Aiden Storm. It was a play on words in a sense. Aiden stood for artificial intelligence developed in a virtual environment natively, and the virtual world he'd been building was both immense and detailed. Using a procedurally developed environment had allowed him to go big right from the start, an entire universe in a box, yet small and detailed enough that when he strapped into the VR headset and gripped the hand sensors he felt he was standing in the middle of New York. At least that was how it normally looked when it booted up. This time though, things seemed glitchy as soon as he booted into the VR loading program and selected the Aiden Storm icon resembling a hand reaching out of a computer screen towards a player wearing a VR headset. But as soon as the program began, zooming in from outer space to the streets below. "Why is it loading so slow?" he frustratingly said out loud. The world seemed just slightly pixelated, or out of focus, and it kept lagging as he booted in. After an eternity of loading, which should be impossible with his state-of-the-art computer, he stood on the streets of New York and looked around Broadway. The streets were oddly quiet, and pieces of trash, a plastic cup, a fast food wrapper floated by in the breeze. The place was a mess. "What the fuck?" he said out loud. What he was seeing wasn't possible, couldn't be possible. When he had left the world just a day before, it had been a bustling city, cars zooming past, businessmen on their way to work, an entire world he'd spent the last 8 months building. He wondered if he'd saved the most recent build 2 days before. Or was it 3? The thought faded as he swore he heard something off in the distance. Was that music, he thought? It sounded like jazz, but he wasn't sure. He preferred deadmau5 and Swedish House Mafia, but it sounded old. He tried to follow the sound, but the way it echoed off the buildings he couldn't quite figure out what direction it was really coming from. "You lost, mister," came a voice right behind him, and he turned around expecting anything but what he saw. He looked like a punk rocker from the old pictures James had seen in his dad's old Rolling Stone magazines he sometimes flipped through. They smelled like musky old glue, but somehow the look was just a little off. His high tops glowed with bright blue LED lights and his eyes shimmered glassy green, and when he smiled it was an ageless grin, but he didn't look a day older than he was. It was almost otherworldly. "Do you hear that music? I'm trying to follow it, but I keep getting lost. It sounds like it's coming from everywhere, and nowhere, all at the same time." James shook his head and focused on the person in front of him. "Who are you?" "What happened here?" he said, waving his hands and spinning in a circle, in his gaming chair in his room. He was getting just a little freaked out. Not much, but a little. Like when the lightning crashed on a dark, windy night. "I'm Ziggy," the green-eyed punk rocker said, jumping onto the hood of a nearby Tesla Model S, his glowing shoes almost floating above the hood as if he was flying. He turned his head to look down the long quiet avenue of the Americas, or at least that's what the sign said, and this is difficult to explain, but he paused in deep thought and stared down at James. "The music is easy. Just go up 3 blocks, take a left, after 2 more blocks turn right. Look for the red door. It's on the right. She's waiting for you." "Who?" James said, trying to memorize the directions, saying it again in his head. But when he looked up, Ziggy was gone. He searched with his eyes up the road and under the cars. Yup. Ziggy was nowhere to be found. "What the hell happened to my game?" he said aloud in his gaming chair and made his way up the empty streets, pushing the thumbstick on his controller. The building shimmered in an odd way. Maybe the ray tracing was lagging, he couldn't be sure, but the build felt gritty, like he could dig up some of the ground with his bare hands, but as unreal as a shimmering mirage in the desert. The music seemed to be getting louder, and it felt louder all around in his 3D headphones. The sense of perspective seemed out of focus. He crossed the street at the 3rd left and made his way down 82nd Avenue, which was as empty as the last one. He used his controller to fast jump to the next intersection, and a few moments of the world blurring past in a whirl. He stood at the steps of a dark brick building with a dark red door. The door seemed realer than any of the objects he'd seen so far, and as he reached for the door he thought he heard skipper feet on a wooden floor above. The music sounded so crisp, better than any music he'd heard in ages. He gripped the brass knob of the door and turned it. It softly swung open, and he stepped into the room.